Good morning, everybody. My name's Scott Power. I'm the Director of the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences at the University of Southern Queensland. And on behalf of the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences and the University of Southern Queensland more broadly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we gather. And again, on behalf of the Centre and the University, I'd like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And this morning, it's my great pleasure to introduce Joshua Gilbert. Joshua is a Worimi man, and Worimi includes lands and waters in the mid-north coast in New South Wales, but it extends beyond that. And Josh is doing a PhD at Charles Sturt University on post-colonial Indigenous agriculture. And through his research, Josh aims to connect traditional Aboriginal knowledge and history to current context, and by translating past wisdom and learning, hopes that it can be used today and in the future. And he's also seeking to develop new insights by bringing the old and the new together. So it sounds like fascinating research. Josh has worked for numerous not-for-profit organisations. He's also worked in the business sector and in the government sector. He's the Indigenous co-chair of Reconciliation New South Wales and was recently recognised within the world's top 50 young gastronomers. And Josh explained to me that just gastronomer is a person who tells stories about food and its production. And today, Josh is going to be talking about the state of Indigenous agriculture, a climate solution. Over to you, Josh. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the opportunity to share some insights with you all today. It's really my pleasure being here to get to share this and really share some of the work that I do and some of the learnings from this research. I want to start, as it is customary for our mob, to start by acknowledging country and paying our deepest respects to elders past and present. I'm a Worimi country, which is home for me, where my dad's ancestors, I'm told, have the first recorded birth in the caves in the mountains that is in the mountain range just behind me, where our family were born, and that that has been written within the cave to notice and really take account that happened at that time. It's country, I think, probably some of the most beautiful country in the world. It's a place that always feels like home for me. And it's country that runs from down almost in Newcastle in the south, up to Foster Tuncurry and almost Taree in the north, and out to the Barrington Tops in the west. So I was sharing with Scott before, it's country that really converses. We've got snow country in the Barrington Tops, which is an hour away from where I am in Gloucester. And an hour to the east will get you to Foster Tuncurry onto the beaches. So I'd like to acknowledge my elders past and present on these lands. To welcome, we say Weeaboo Gidgiyugu, which means hi, hello there, welcome all. And when the welcome is finished in our language, we always say Gathaniran, which means let us go together. And for me, that's really the spirit in which our mob work, not only here on Worimi country, but right across New South Wales and further across Australia. I'm going to share today a bit of a mix of things that I've been thinking, where my research and personal experiences has kind of melded together. I'm fortunate that my family are on this country with me, that we're able to work within the agricultural space and think about this in a really practical and theoretical level at the same time, and try and meld all that together in what that's going to mean for us on Worimi country into the future. To really share and to showcase where I think this work is going, I think it's important to share why I'm doing this work and why this context is. And I'll share some of the history around this. But for me, the vision is really quite clear that we know our mob and mobs across the country have incredible climate knowledge incredible knowledge about these landscapes and incredible knowledge around agriculture and food production and keeping this country in its perfect state. And for me, that's been lost over the last 200 years. And we know that we need to regain and share that back, conversing between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, letting us go together to really inform what the future of this landscape is going to look like. And with that spirit, I guess it's important for me to share. My driver for this is, I guess, really recognizing that I would like Worimi people to be farming Worimi country for the next 60,000 years, just as we've been doing for the last 60,000 years. And it's within that context that I always try and think. So when you think about sustainability, quite often we have 5 and 10-year plans. And in my mind, that's not enough to really think about sustainability. And particularly when we think about the impacts of climate change on lands. And we know our mobs have stories that go back tens of thousands of years that are so important to capture, to understand and know, so that we can think about what this country will look like into the future. So here's an image of home. This is the Barrington River, probably 2 kilometers just out these windows here away. Its country, Worimi country at large, was first colonized in the early 1800s for the purpose of agricultural export. In fact, it's really some of the first country that was noted in Australia by white colonizers to say that this is where we want to start an agricultural company, an agricultural organization, purely for the idea of exporting food and particularly exporting wool in this area. Our country goes back to obviously our Indigenous heritages here, but in terms of white history, goes back to when the Australian Agricultural Company first got gifted 1 million acres of Worimi country. And they also, were able to raise £1 million from overseas to help start this venture here. Now, I'm really interested in the history of this, that, this big agricultural company that still exists some 200 years later had this relationship with our mob here. And to give you a sense of what that was like and what the understanding of the landscape was like, I went back to some of the early archived information around what this country was like in terms of Western journals. And some of the first people that roamed through this country shared that this country reminded them of England, that the Buckens, the mountain range that you can see in the back of this photo and that's bang out in front of me, in front of these windows, reminded them of castles collapsing in this perfect environment and this perfect landscape, that the country was almost so alike England that they thought that this would be prime agricultural land for sheep production, which it definitely is not. And they shared that this kind of park-like estate that you'll know that people like Charles Massey and others kind of talk about in the journals that they read right across Australia. And that was very much the sense of what the very early agricultural colonizers had when they came to this land. Importantly, when the company first got set up, day one of landing just down about an hour south of me in a place called Kurua, when the company first landed there, they came by boat, and the local Worimi people helped them build their campsites at night, helped them get an understanding of these lands, and really started showcasing the best of our mob and, giving back, being so humble and open to sharing our knowledges. And for me, that's really important because it shows that generosity and this testament to doing things together. And I think that for me is what is lacking so much when we think about this space at the moment. So the very first journal before that got sent back to England, back to the shareholders of this new company, the biggest agricultural company of the time in Australia. The biggest, or one of the biggest still in Australia today. The very first journal article on the bottom of page 1, the author writes, "The Indigenous people have been so good to us, and should they not come and attack our people or do us any ill fate, we should continue to look after them and nurture them on these lands." And for me, this is a really interesting comment to write, particularly when it's done at a time before writing back to the shareholders about the sheep or the country, before writing back around what the investment of this company is doing on these lands that are so far away. They talk about our people, our mob, and the importance of connecting here. And this is a relationship that kind of forged on this country over time, where our mob helped guide Western agriculturalists through the country to understand it. Like a lot of lands across Australia, our people told of where the best water sources were for cattle and for sheep at the time, where the best green grasses were for them to go and get a healthy feed for the livestock, where they camp at night, where some of the stories are across these lands, where you can and cannot go. And all of these yarns transpired into this melting pot of cultures that all came together on this place. And here on Warramai country, it came together through agriculture. My family history, I'm a Bug family descendant, and our story on this country is where we not only had this yarn happening, but where our non-Indigenous family and our Indigenous family came together to get married, where the fight over land and livestock forced our people together for marriage. And that's a really important thing, that this mutual understanding, this mutual respect of knowledges were coming together to transpire on this land. And that's the kind of genesis, I think, of the stories that we need to continue learning from, that this coming together, bringing Indigenous knowledge, 60,000 plus years of history and understanding of landscapes, and modern Western science needs to meld together to create good outcomes. And I think it's important, and I always try and frame that this is a view that we have many Indigenous mobs across Australia, that there's diversity across our people, just as there's diversity across non-Indigenous Australia. And that all of us have different experiences and understandings of agriculture and science as well. I always think the other thing that's important for me is that agriculture often came first to these landscapes, that white society didn't just rock up on the shores in every place, set up a tent and then try to have different relationships. Quite often, the impact of white society threatened Indigenous people before white people were seen. So on some of these countries, we know that diseases quite often transpired ahead of colonization. We know that as Indigenous people were forced off their lands, quite often they went to the next lands, and that there was a conflict that could occur with some of these tribes or nations coming together. And quite often, agriculture was a preceding act around coming to these countries. So livestock were quite often pushed upon different lands before white settlement was seen, and that livestock were there making their way through colonizing the landscape before people were. So fundamentally, I think it's important to recognize that agriculture is a colonizing act, that the very process of Western agricultural systems, the very foundational base of these is to go out, take over land. The way in which Australia was colonized, quite interestingly, gave people the right to go and plow around a paddock and then say that land is theirs, or put up some fences, or notch something into a tree to show ownership of that country, which for me is really quite fascinating, when our mobs were doing all of those acts at the same time, but that wasn't recognized. So thinking about agriculture as a colonizing act really forces us to think about what this is going to look like in the future and how we uncolonize or decolonize the sector of a place that is so fundamentally based upon these actions. So for me, it's important to understand where we're currently at. Essentially, the understanding of agricultural or Indigenous held lands for predominantly agriculture or other purposes has gone through this big transformation from obviously Indigenous held lands through Indigenous law, LORE, kind of having this relationship with all of what we know as Australia now, to fundamentally basically losing everything at the time of colonization. Over time, you can see through this map on the left that Indigenous land holdings through Western systems has shown that this expanding Indigenous estate. And we think that that's probably about 60% of Australia's landmass now, that there's some kind of native title hold or different types of land holding that Indigenous people have over about 60% of Australia's landmass. This isn't complete. We don't really have an understanding of what Indigenous freehold title looks like in Australia. So it's probably conservative, but could actually equate to a bit more country. And we know that the federal government under the Closing the Gap scheme has a view of increasing this by a further 15% by 2030. So fundamentally what we'll have is 3.5% of the Australian population of Indigenous people who will own under Western systems about 75% of Australia's landmass. And that's a really important statistic to think about how we're going to work with country, how we're going to understand that, and then how do we equip Indigenous populations to maintain, manage, and look after that land, whether that be for agriculture or conservation projects, renewable projects, or a range of other things. There's a lot of opportunities that come with that, but there's quite a lot of restrictions around just holding an asset and not being able to fund projects with it upon it. In terms of other agricultural notions around Indigenous ag, there is very limited literature in this space that really acknowledges the ingenuity and adaptability of Indigenous people to Western agriculture. So while we know that the relationships, like my family history, of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people coming together and sharing knowledges and systems and understanding, we have very little literature that really acknowledges that, and particularly acknowledges that in terms of the benefits that Indigenous people provided to agricultural systems into the future, at that time, and then also what that could be within the future. Instead, our kind of current position in Australia is that we still contend, or still find it necessary to contend, that whether agricultural systems were evident prior to colonization. So we have this debate that happens in academic literature, but also within non-fiction literature, that really contends whether there was an agricultural system in place. And I'll show you the definition of what agriculture was. But fundamentally, we're still having this argument around what that looks like, rather than looking at what it means now. And that's a really nuanced position that Australia has compared to the rest of the world. So, for instance, in the United States, they've kind of accepted that there was an agricultural system. They've moved on, and they're now building a robust agricultural First Nations organizational-led approach to what that looks like, and then how they can upskill First Nations farmers around agriculture. And that's seen in some of the works by Cronin. This is really 40 years behind some of our international colleagues. And really what we need to do is kind of take this broader view and perspective of what Indigenous agriculture or farming is, that really the Indigenous people engaging in this space should be recognized no matter what they're farming, rather than this nuanced view around whether Indigenous agriculture is quite limited to traditional Indigenous systems, and whether that kind of was happening prior to colonization or not. So I just want to share some of the agricultural systems that we had here. And this is a photo of the Brewarra and the fish traps out in Western New South Wales. It's one of the oldest one of the oldest man-made products. And what it does is changes the natural flow of the water to ensure that fishing upon this land would be a lot easier. And fundamentally, I guess, the stories that came out of this period, out of this location at the time, was this really interesting view about how lazy Indigenous people were, that they could just cast a line out and catch fish within this system because they were so right for the taking, rather than marveling at the ingenuity and genius of such systems. And we know that this happened on land-based agricultural systems as well, that mob who hunted kangaroos, for instance, formed similar kind of trap infrastructure so that they could capture kangaroos in one place to then hunt them very easily. All of these, having looked through a Western lens, kind of paint Indigenous people as some of that really stereotypical viewpoints that I think continue to transpire into today's conversations, rather than really acknowledging the absolute genius and the long-standing thinking and approach of what these systems took place. So when we look at this view of what agriculture is and what this means, there's kind of this multi-sector approach. And really, basically, these are a lot of words to say that as to why people think or do not think Indigenous people were engaged in agricultural systems. It's quite fascinating to see that some of the scopes that or some of the arguments that have been made. But I guess fundamentally, when I think about this, I look at just the very simple viewpoint that we know Indigenous people have been here for at least 60,000 years. There's stone grind groovings right across Australia that talk about a predominant wheat belt or a native grain belt that existed. We know that there's a whole heap of relationships with food and stories around food that are so important. And we know that Indigenous people had been here because of that 60,000 year history and had obviously been able to eat over that time. So, we have a population that was able to sustain themselves for a long period of time. And we should acknowledge that there is a food system or agricultural system that really tips its hat to that. And some of these yarns, I guess, really show why this kind of challenging nuance existed around whether agriculture, in quotations, comparing that to a Western system, existed. So you get quotes like, "All people do not see any necessity to go beyond their existing environmental modifications. There was a deep commitment to the maintenance of fertility through engagement with spiritual powers left for them by the dreaming," or that Aboriginal people were hyper-conservative and change was generally frowned upon seriously. So these are the kind of debates and rebuttals around an agricultural system, but really don't, I guess, paint our mob in the best light. And I think for me, it's important to understand how this is perpetuated today. And this certainly happens in the science sector. It certainly happens in the climate space as well, that there is a huge risk that we continue thinking about Indigenous people as fixed species or beings, rather than as a fluid culture of huge, enormous opportunity and learnings that have had a long history. So I see that all the time in the bush food space, for instance. There's 6,500 bush foods in Australia. We've commercialized probably about 13 of these successfully, the others with varying degrees of experience. But when we think about Indigenous agriculture, or when we're told about Indigenous agriculture, in terms of literature, in terms of media, we always think about mobs' engagement with bush foods. Now, the Cine community often thinks back around, well, why is this the case? And I'm starting to think that maybe the effect or the understanding of this is because of Mabo, that for us to show a continuing cultural connection to land, we have to show that our cultural practices have remained over time, and that we have this preference to showing this real, authentic, puristic view of Indigenous culture to then maintain that level of connection, rather than acknowledging this broader understanding that wouldn't it be recognized by the courts that us as Indigenous people have moved on, that we've been involved in a whole range of different agricultural systems since this time. So for me, there's a lot of opportunity to broaden our perspective around what Indigenous agriculture and Indigenous knowledges are, to notice that we're not just a static culture, that we have improved fundamentally in terms of Western science and understanding and knowledges over the last 200 years, and continue to weave our traditional and cultural knowledge through the Western lens to understand today's society and hopefully the future. This provides a lot of opportunity for us when we take this broader perspective, that we think about, our knowledges in terms of how they've adapted over time. What's the importance of that knowledge and the ecosystems that we work within now, and how can we apply that to today's society or modernity, rather than just having it as a fixed system point in time back 200 years ago that we need to keep clinging hold of. I would just say probably the other challenge is that despite having these systems that are apparently ours, they're very quick to be ripped off by non-Indigenous Australia. So take the bush food sector, for instance. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, that there's a lot of opportunities that come out of bush foods, but less than 1%, and I mean really less than 1% of the revenue generated from the traditional knowledge and cultural IP that our people own around this sector, less than 1% of the revenue comes back to First Nations people on the ground. So despite this kind of viewpoint and positioning that Indigenous people should only be doing Indigenous things, we're even kind of kicked out of our own industry for white exploitation still today. So there's a huge amount of work to be done around what this should look like. And I think taking a broader perspective on Indigenous agriculture and Indigenous society and culture and how that is adapted through time is really fundamental to understanding what our future holds together. To put really bluntly and simply, rather than looking at the authenticity of Aboriginal people over time, we should start, and where our culture stands, we should kind of live by this credence, I guess. And this is a gift for me from someone I'm sure you all know, Stan Grant, who said, an Aboriginal person farming today is as authentically Aboriginal as what he or she would have been throughout time. We're the same people, but just a people in change. And I guess this really speaks to the notion that it doesn't matter if we have Indigenous people farming bush foods or native grains, or whether we have Indigenous people out there farming beef cattle or cropping wheat or shearing sheep for a livelihood. All of that is in the remit of what Indigenous Australia is. And we should recognize and respect Indigenous culture over time around how that's transpired and what the opportunities are through our fluidity of culture. So what does this look like practically? Well, this is a really fundamental example for me. This is the Gemay Ranges, and based out of La Perouse in Sydney. It's a really old Aboriginal village. It has changed quite a lot, I guess, in the last 20 or 30 years. But there is an Aboriginal project and program there. It's an Indigenous Ranges project. And it fundamentally provides the skills and opportunity for mob to be out on country, on a range of boats and on land as well, to really assess what's happening on this landscape, to really understand what the nuances are and to really read the land and report that through new technology. For me, this is really fascinating because what it does is provide us with that understanding around how our knowledge of a place, the stories that sit behind it, and how our changing cultural knowledge over time into modernity can all be compacted to understand what's going on in such an interesting place. We can look at things like biosecurity risk and what the impacts of that have been, how we can really understand the landscape through a new lens and really report on that in nuanced Indigenous ways to provide new understanding, not just for Indigenous Australia, but for all Australians. And there's a whole heap of these range of programs across Australia which provide the opportunity to do this. I'd probably like to add on this. I don't think ranger programs are it, that while they are an essential ingredient and part of this understanding of the landscape, we also need Indigenous agriculturalists to continue working in this space so that we can record their Indigenous knowledges and sciences as well, almost like citizen science projects to really understand what's happening within all landscapes across Australia. And another example of this is that is this farm at Nauru. It's located down in the Yass Valley, and the farmer here, or the farming family from this area, actually have given some of their land back to Indigenous people from that land so that they can continue to connect and learn together. This whole idea of coming together and sharing stories, and that being powerful enough to really transport the way in which we connect and relate to land. This is a really fascinating and powerful example of what happens when you have this connection and relationship still today, that, you know, basically giving and gifting land back to traditional owners can provide some really good examples of what that power looks like, the power changes that need to happen. So that provides a really good sense as to some of the things that we can do. And I just want to start by sharing where I guess my research is, and I guess by sharing where my research is at and kind of where this thinking all comes together. So we know Indigenous people have played an important part in the Australian agricultural landscape, whether we like it or not. The way in which our relationship merged together as people has been so important around what we see within the landscape today and how we understand it. There's really fascinating stories about Indigenous people teaching young kids their traditional languages so that they can understand the landscape better. And then the flip side of that is having non-Indigenous people teach our mob how to better engage with technology and systems, or start farming through Western lenses. We know that mob have taught some of the farmers that still exist today how to burn country and how to have that connection and relationship with that. I'm sorry. And that's really important and powerful around what the future is going to hold. And we know that there's a lot of opportunity that exists when we start actually connecting that massive 60% of Australia's landmass slowly growing to 75% around opportunities for young mob to start farming, the only growing youth cohort in Australia, to start doing that, but to also start understanding the nuances that are happening on their land, to report that to bigger understandings of landscapes. I think it's important to know that we are dragging the chain around our engagement within Indigenous agriculture at large, and that we're more than 40 years behind our international colleagues. Here in Australia, as I said, we're still having these debates as to whether Indigenous agriculture pre-colonisation was really agriculture, or whether we were authentically farming in terms of Western farming systems at the time that the First Fleet landed here. there is so much work for us to do to really take on the next wave of understanding in this space, to really think about what Indigenous agriculture is going to look like into the future, and really start sharing and championing Indigenous agriculture and that kind of broader perspective of us transforming through our cultural lens through next generations. And there's a whole heap of risk around where that's going to come from. So at the moment, there are less than 5 Indigenous agricultural graduates across every university in Australia. And I always get caught up on this, because when I say 5, people think 5%, but no, just the number 5. That's how many ag graduates we have coming out of universities. And we have really, really low levels of enrollment that then transpire into those really low numbers. And that's every university across Australia where those kids are coming out. So we need to help support a healthy pipeline of talent within the ag sector. And we also need to encourage mob to think about this as a career choice that doesn't just look at it within a 2-dimensional right, but really looks at it within the ways in which we promote those that are already doing the work, to show that we belong in this sector, to show that we do have a workforce that currently exists and that we need to grow that, and that we're welcome in the space despite a whole 200 years of colonization, where agriculture was really the fighting force for us to get off our lands. So there's a lot of work to be done there. We know that the agricultural workforce is around 2.7% Indigenous, and that provides a healthy base for us to continue working on. But there is no connection point for that 2.7% with any kind of interest or alignment around how we can better support Indigenous people within the workforce. We need leadership and understanding, acknowledgement and healing in this space. That these conversations can't happen without the opportunity to share the stories of what's happened in the past, both the really beautiful stories of families coming together, but also the tragedies of our people being forced off our lands, the murders and unpaid wages that have occurred in the agricultural space, that's really forced this fraction between Western farmers and Indigenous farmers. And we need to really call out the racism that exists still currently in these spaces, and really work on what a culturally aware workforce and agricultural sector is going to look like into the future. We also have no understanding around the size and scale of Indigenous farmers in Australia. And we also don't know what the impacts of intergenerational wealth have been on that. So we actually don't have a clear view as to how many Indigenous farmers are in Australia. We don't know what they're farming, where they're from. We don't know what their nuanced interests are, what business support they might need. We don't know how we can support them better to access government grants or funding, how to access voices around agricultural lobbying, how we can better support them to export their products overseas, or whether there's even proactive opportunities to support them through a range of different branding or different types of agricultural nuances like they have done in the US, that really showcases what Indigenous products are and offers them for sale as an Indigenous farmed product. And we know that intergenerational wealth has had a tremendous impact upon, or the lack of intergenerational wealth has had an impact on Indigenous people, and that's particularly going to happen more and more in agriculture. While agricultural lands have been increasing by about 22% for the last few years, and a doubling in price every 7 years, there is a huge gap for us to try and get young people into the market, to then be able to farm sustainably and healthy in terms of their own financial and personal health, to farm agricultural commodities that they care about. And only together, through connections upon land, that can we address climate change and understand the impact of climate change upon lands, right across this state. So we actually need to be proactive about this. We need to form relationships, and we need to address some of the issues that are stopping this. So some of the yarns I've been exposed to around these conversations are, yeah, we know that there's scar trees and important cultural artifacts on our farm, but we're so worried Indigenous people are going to come and take over through native title that we're going to lose it. So we just don't talk about it. Or we know that there's sacred trees. We get the Aboriginal people to come and look at it once a year. And during that time, we like move all the cattle off the area so that it looks like it's protected. We fence it off. But as soon as they leave, we open it all back up and just let the cattle rub up against it. They're the kinds of stories and the friction that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous farmers, and all of that needs to change so that we can work together to better understand what's happening in the local area and then share what's been happening over a long period of time. And lastly, I just want to touch on this. I don't want to share a view on the Uluru Statement. I don't want to have a yarn around what this will look like. But I think fundamentally for me, what I think is important to acknowledge is that later this year, we'll have a choice to vote around the referendum based on the Uluru Statement. And we know that we need voices not only within Parliament, but a whole range of agricultural and environmental organisations in Australia. We know, given that large land holding, the power dynamics and shifts that need to happen in this space, that every agricultural and environmental organisation in Australia should at least have First Nations engagement, preferably Indigenous people on the board, and preferably Indigenous staff within their organisation. And I think for me, this kickstarts that conversation around what that looks like. Preferably, we will have really incredible self-determined organizations that do this. And some of the work based on what I've just shared with you is really advocating for a First Nations Indigenous Agricultural Research and Development Corporation so that we can define the projects that we fund and invest our research dollars in as First Nations people, rather than being subjected to the projects that come up and we get coerced into. So I'll leave with that, but I just want to share that this is an important stage, not only in terms of the Constitution, but I think what it does do is provide us with an opportunity to have a broader conversation around what does representation look in every organisation across Australia. That's it for me. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks so much for the yarn. Certainly happy to field any questions. And if there are any questions that come through the YouTube channels, or you want to connect later on, I'm more than happy to do that. I can talk forever on this stuff. So feel free to reach out, and I'm always happy to continue having that conversation.
Great. Thanks very much, Josh. Thanks very much for an excellent presentation and broad-ranging presentation. Very interesting stuff. And now I'd like to pass over to Will Hay. Will moderate the Q&A session. Are you there, Will?
I am. Good morning.
Good morning.
Again, Josh, thank you for your talk, and Scott for facilitating. So this morning, we've had a few attendees, which is great. We do have a shout out / hello to Josh from Mandy Hopkins in the Q&A. So shout out from Mandy. But also Mandy does have a question. So her question is, thanks so much for the fabulous and thought-provoking presentation this morning, Josh. Climate change is change on country quicker than may have been set on the past. I see this as a critical place for the Western science and traditional science to connect to ensure sustainability. What do you think?
Yeah, I think change is obviously happening a lot quicker than what we'd like, and probably a lot broader than what we'd like. Just the impacts of climate change on country is really hard to understand, and creates a lot of challenges. So just in terms of some of the things we've seen here on our country over the last 3 years, we've had 2 pretty incredible floods. We've had one that basically wiped out half of the businesses in our main street, and that really kind of challenged the way we think about floods in this town, particularly for younger generations. We also had a pretty bad drought before then, that, you know, was certainly the worst that my family have seen, that my grandfather and grandmother, who are still alive, have ever seen. And certainly the worst one, I guess, keeping the oral history around, is the worst one that we've experienced for a long time. We've also had some bushfires that have threatened a lot of our townships and our property as well, which add to the challenge. And now we've got this really odd season, I think, around, it's been good in some ways, but bad in others, and it's just really hard to read. I think the chance to connect is about the connection point is around understanding all the yarns that fill up to where we are now, to understand what's happened. And for me, understanding that through a nuanced perspective around particular countries is important. So only, Worimi people who connect with people living on Worimi country should really provide that nuanced view around what that shared history and shared opportunity in the future has been like. And I think we can use that as a melting pot to bring all of that together. I think it's important to probably say as well that the impacts of climate events haven't always been positive for our mob. Some of the big floods down in Newcastle that happened in the 60s and 70s, we have people who share stories of that around having to hide from police so that their kids didn't get stolen. That when the helicopters from the Defence Forces that came around that provided food and water for people so that they could survive because they were isolated for days at a time, flew over the top of Indigenous people and ignored them in those recovery efforts. And that's all within living memory around what these climate change activities and events have looked like for our mob. So where we can actually come together, have that truth telling around that, and actually band together, I think it actually brings out the best of us. I'd like to think that we're a lot better off now than what we were kind of 30, 40 years ago, and that we've learnt a lot. But really that coming together to understand not only proactively what we can do to help combat climate change and to understand what's happening and when it's happening, but the flip side of that, going through really traumatic climate events together, is going to be really powerful for us into the future.
Awesome, thank you. I do have another question from Tim Cohen, who is a researcher within the uni here as well. So Tim states, great talk, Josh. I was wondering what your thoughts are on how Indigenous agriculture can play a leading role in preventing further biodiversity losses. Example, rewilding, managing invasive species, etc.
Yeah, this is a great one. So I think there's a lot of opportunity that comes with this. We obviously know that native grain species, for instance, have a huge opportunity for us to collect carbon, have natural species in the ground that don't require huge amounts of water or pesticides and herbicides on their use. So that provides a really fundamental quick win, I think, for me, across many properties and across a really big range of Australia as well. That there's a whole range of different native grains species that exist that we can be doing things with there. It's also really interesting, the regenerative agricultural movement that's kind of happening in Australia. I think it's maturing quite a bit, but it's a space that, particularly from the US, is said to be based upon Indigenous knowledge, but yet there's not many Indigenous people involved within the advocacy for regenerative agriculture. And we kind of see that in Australia as well, that regenerative agriculture kind of at large has been taken over by rich white guys who are out there doing their thing and have the capacity and capability to farm in different ways, and they can take a bit of a hit one year, and they don't necessarily have the relationship with First Nations people that they should have, given this is meant to be based upon a First Nations approach. So I think for me, just talks about that fundamental element around connecting, sharing the stories and coming together to, I guess, in my mind, what we do need to do is create a truly Australian agricultural system. And while we've had Western agriculture over here developing as much as it can, trying to work within the environmental limits, and then with climate change on top, trying to get that approach working, we've had Indigenous agriculture over here doing its own thing and not really talking. So when we can bring those both together, we can produce a fully Australian agricultural system, and that will provide a lot of opportunities to working to the environment, recognizing climate change, and produce this bigger system that we need to really get through this.
Great, thank you. Another question from Mandy. How can we, universities, work with communities to increase Indigenous students in not only agriculture, but agriculture and climate?
Yeah, thanks, Mandy. This is a good one as well. So really, we need to encourage mob within the science sector. So I'd really encourage, if you haven't seen the work of Deadly Science, to really check them out. They're a really great Indigenous program that's trying to get mob involved in science, and I think there's some opportunities that come with that. In the ag space, it's still hard ground, but CSU have actually just developed a range of scholarships for First Nations people who want to study agriculture, and I think that's going to provide a pipeline into the future around what that will look like. I think we need to recognize the history and why the difficulties are there, that our mob have been excluded from these conversations, that we've invested a lot of money, particularly in the science fields, to reaffirm Indigenous knowledge rather than just accepting Indigenous knowledge as Indigenous knowledge and kind of utilizing that going forward. So there's a lot to be gained around those partnerships, recognizing the history. And then I think for me, the fundamental bit is to look at how we can partner to show Indigenous people in the sector, to show that we belong, and to try and build that pipeline through. And I think for me, then there's a whole range of things that universities should be doing around supporting Indigenous kids through university, and then particularly in the workforce as well. So we know once mob get into the workforce, it's not all happy days and sunshine. There's a whole heap of racism, cultural load, and cultural strain that happen, or identity strain that happens within workplaces. And we need to kind of work on all of that to try and address some of the issues. And maybe, sorry, just my other quick 2-cent bit is we also need reconciliation action plans to have firm commitments around this. So in the ag space, for instance, there's less than a handful of agricultural organizations that have reconciliation action plans. And most of them are government-based. None of the agricultural research and development corporations have a reconciliation action plan. Some have tried and failed, but there's no real targets around what does the Indigenous recruitment and talent pipeline need to look like within the ag sector. And without those firm commitments and somebody holding these organizations to account, they're not investing the dollars back in schools and at university level to try and build that pipeline to get them into the future.
Cool. Thanks, Josh. And that is all for our open questions this morning. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Will, and thank you for expertly facilitating the Q&A session. And thanks again, Josh, for a great talk and for a lot of thoughtful insights during the Q&A. And I'd also like to thank Will for expertly organising the whole event. And thanks finally to all of the participants, including those who